Okay, before we go, let's talk about the 23rd Psalm. Do y'all know this? Yea, though I walk through the what? Valley of what? Shadow of death. What is that? Dying. For just a minute, chapter 21 and 22, how do you get to heaven? Well, there are two options. Death, which is how most people have to go through the valley of shadow of death. Probably 99.99999 of all believers have to die. Now, that very small number that are still alive and remain to the coming of the Lord won't die. They'll be changed. Now, I pastored a church in Oklahoma. Bonnie and I shared our lives there. The founder of the church was an ardent rapture believer. He was like 90-some years old. His name was Willard, and he was really struggling because he had emphysema, he had all kinds of stuff, and he was dying. And his wife came to see me, and she said, Pastor, will you go talk to Willard? He is so convinced that the rapture is going to happen before he has to die that it's actually depressing him. Because every time the doctor comes, he tells the doctor, no, I'm not going to die, I'm going to be raptured. And so I came and stood at his bedside and brought my Bible, and I shared two verses with him. One, that verse, and the other one in Hebrews 9. I said, Willard, and he had his breathing mask on, and he looked up at me. I said, Willard, I said, did you know that there are two raptures? He was Dallas Seminary trained, Philadelphia College of the Bible educated, Bible scholar, and he looked at me and his eyes narrowed. He said, what do you mean two? I said, I said, the first rapture is the group bus. I said, and all those who are alive and remain to the coming of the Lord, all of them go on the group bus. But I said, the 23rd Psalm says, when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, all alone, I will fear no evil because you're with me. I said, did you know there's a personal rapture? Where Jesus comes right to where you are before you die and walks you home? He said, how do you know that? I said, well, it says in Hebrews chapter 9, it's appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. For believers, Jesus said, whoever lives and believes in me will never what? Die. Never die. Our body dies, we don't. We're totally conscious the whole time. In fact, you're going to be conscious forever. My body's going to wear it. Mine's really worn out. You guys have a lot of time left on yours, but as you saw Mark Strout's little clock, you have a lot less than you realize. I love that illustration he gave. He's a good teacher. I said, Willard, which do you think is better? The big bus with everybody going, or do you want the personal valet, private chauffeured trip to heaven? That was about noon. And he looked at me and he said, could you read all that to me again? And tell me all that again. His wife was just, because he was just so anxious. He didn't want to miss the rapture. And I was telling him, you're not going to miss it. You either get the group one where we're all changed in a moment and meet the Lord in the air, or Jesus is going to come right to you. And he died about 6 o'clock that afternoon, peacefully. He let his wife know he wanted the private transfer. He didn't want to wait for the group. Well, let's see, I have enough time. This will take 3 minutes. One of the things Bonnie and I have loved to do in all of our years of ministry is funerals. A funeral is the declaration of the sum of someone's life. And I love funeral services. We always had all the people in the church write out their testimony on a piece of paper. I said, before your wife or your husband is trying to prepare your service, you ought to write how you met Christ and your favorite verses, your favorite hymns, and you ought to give it to someone. And once I said that, people started giving me their funeral sheet. And so I had a whole file of all the old people that wanted me to do their funeral, and I did hundreds of them, hundreds of funerals. Here's one. Jesus visited Kalamazoo, Michigan on Sunday, November 6th, to meet another of his precious children. Just as the dark, cold river of death began to flow, and the valley of death's shadow began to creak open, the only one who ever defeated death and destroyed him that had the power of death, that is the devil, extended his arms toward David. This is David's funeral. It was 5:45 a.m. And all of a sudden, David, in the hospital room, was acutely aware that he heard a voice. And as he listened, he realized, over the hissing of all the machines and the breathing pipe that was down his throat and all the picks and things that were in his arms, that was a voice he knew really well. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me." This was my friend David's last moment on earth. So to the voice of his good shepherd, David looked up on Sunday morning for what would be the greatest day of his life. David had heard the voice of Jesus coming to take him to heaven. David looked at Jesus standing there, and the one who was crushed for his iniquities, he saw. As he looked in Jesus' face, he saw the one that was bruised for his transgressions. And then David looked at the hands that were extended to him. And those hands were the ones pierced for his sins on the cross. And those nail-scarred hands were reaching out for his. And in that moment, David reached up to him. Well, his family, who were all gathered around his bed in the hospital at 5:45 a.m., only saw his tired and worn-out body was starting to fall silent. If you've ever been next to someone, which, if you're with your grandparents or parents someday, it's amazing to see what happens. They go from pink to gray very rapidly. You just say the life just leaves them. That's what his family saw. His tired and worn out body fell silent, but David had already firmly grasped the hand of Jesus. He had slipped quietly out of bed. He was headed with Jesus to the place Jesus had prepared for him, in God his Father's home above. In that instant, at last, David was glorified into Christ's likeness and had stepped into endless life because of the amazing grace of God. So while we were taking care of the funeral, and everyone throws their flowers down on top of the casket or whatever they do in the tradition of the area, what was David doing? See, a lot of times we don't think about this. As we learn in Revelation 3:5, David came led by the nail-scarred hand of Jesus to meet his heavenly Father because Jesus paid for his time to be forever in heaven. By the way, that's our highest delight. Together before God. It's a miracle of grace. This is what happens, recorded, as we saw last week in Revelation 3:5. Jesus tells us, "I will confess your name before my Father, before all of his angels." So at that moment, sometime before 6 a.m. on Sunday, David had been taken by the hand. The Lord led him past all the ranks of angels, all the way up the boulevard we're reading about in Revelation 22, past the cherubim and the seraphim, up to the very throne of God. And David heard Jesus Christ call him by a name that no one else knew and presented him in person to God as his beloved child. Then he heard God the Father say, like we do in the parable of the father and the prodigal son. Remember what he said? "Put the best robe on him." Think of what God gives us. A robe white, as bright as the day, pure as light. When Jesus was transfigured on the mount, something happened to him. Not just his countenance, his face. Something happened to his clothes. He became white as light. And that's the reward for all who've been completely forgiven, to be invited to walk before God